Well, just a couple of words about the South Asia Collective. We are a group of research and advocacy organizations from different corners of South Asia that got together in 2015 to set up a regional forum for creating knowledge, raising awareness, and developing citizens' capacity on minority rights, cutting across national and identity boundaries. As you know, despite a legacy of discriminations and targeting of minorities, South Asia is one of the few regions without any formal regional human rights norms and mechanisms. Over the past years, we have brought out annual reports documenting the condition of the region's minorities, contributed to raising awareness on their situation, and have leveraged the opportunity to share and learn across borders. The hope is that our work, along with that of other regional civil society voices, will contribute to filling the norms and capacity gap in the region on minority as well as human rights. The current 2020 edition of the South Asia State of Minorities report is on the theme of the shrinking civic space in South Asia, especially for its minorities, a topic we are glad we decided to put our energies into, given how relevant it is proving to be today. We are absolutely delighted and honored to have Ms. Mary Lawlor, the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders, as our keynote speaker. We're also very pleased to have Ms. Deanne Uyangoda of Frontline Defenders and Ms. Poonam Joshi of the Funders Initiative for Civil Society as discussants. We are grateful to you, distinguished panelists, for making time to be with us today and for your encouragements. The first half of the meeting is set up for our panelists to speak to the findings of the report and the subject of the narrowing civic space in South Asia. We have budgeted all of the second half of the meeting for questions and answers that will follow immediately after. Given we are covering all 7 countries, each covered in the report in its own right, there's a chance that there might not be too much time for oral interventions during the Q&A session. I urge everyone, therefore, to kindly use Zoom's chat function to type in your comments and questions. Authors of individual chapters will then respond to the questions during the Q&A round. And we will close the meeting with concluding remarks by our panelists, and hope to do all of this in an hour's time. Some more housekeeping points before we kick off. The webinar, as I have already mentioned, is being recorded and will be available on our website in due course. And the website is theSouthAsiaCollective.org. E-copy of the report is now available on our website, and we'll be sharing the link in the chat box. I request also to please keep your mics muted and video switched off whilst others are speaking. And as already mentioned, do please type in your questions and comments in chat for us to address those during Q&A session. Well, without further ado, let me now invite Ms. Mary Lawlor to deliver her keynote address. But before that, a little introduction. Mary took up the mandate of Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders in May 2020. She has worked extensively with and on the situation of human rights defenders. In 2001, she founded Frontline Defenders to concentrate on human rights defenders at risk, and was its executive director from 2001 through to 2016. Mary has previously worked with the Irish section of Amnesty International in various capacities, including its director as well as chair of its board over extended periods. Mary is currently an adjunct professor of business and human rights in the Centre for Social Innovation, School of Business, Trinity College, Dublin. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Mary Lawlor. I'm sorry, Mary. Yes.
I always forget that. So thank you all very much for having me here today. It's not the same as being there in person, but I've learned over the last few months that online meetings have advantages too. Some human rights defenders working in remote or isolated regions who would normally struggle to meet NGOs or to connect with other defenders across the world are able to do so in these sorts of meetings. Since I took up the mandate 7 months ago, I've been talking to human rights defenders nearly every day online, and have heard firsthand from hundreds and hundreds of defenders how they're adjusting to the new challenges posed by COVID and how they're coping under new travel restrictions and emergency laws. Your new report addresses many of these issues, including how human rights defenders standing in defense of human rights of minorities often bear the brunt of restrictions and targeting. High Commissioner for Human Rights Michelle Bachelet rightly described civic space as the lifeblood of any healthy democracy and society. But civic space is under attack all over the world, with core civic freedoms of expression, association, peaceful assembly widely denied. Restrictive legislation and administrative provisions have been hallmarks of repression, with human rights defenders often their prime targets. There is no more direct threat to civic space than the targeting of human rights defenders, and my next report to the Human Rights Council in March 2021 will be on the issue of the killing of human rights defenders. Your report reminds me that South Asia mirrors these global trends. Throughout the region, states are increasingly resorting to censorship, imposition of restrictive laws, criminal defamation, harassment and detention of protesters, and the targeting of human rights defenders. I've spoken to many defenders in the region over the last few months, and they've told me about how the environment for their work is becoming more difficult and more hostile. Many are experiencing that from their governments, but also from non-state actors. Your important report exposes how this erosion of rights and the closing of space for defenders to work in is happening right across the region, with dangerous consequences for those working to defend the right of South Asia's sizable minorities, religious, ethnic, linguistic, and caste. But civic space is under attack all over the world, as I said, with core civic freedoms of expression and peaceful assembly widely denied. And it's worth noting that in a recent report, it was claimed 97% of the region's population lives in conditions where civic space is repressed, just a bit better than closed. Throughout the region, states are increasingly resorting to censorship, imposition of restrictive laws and criminal defamation, harassment and detention of protesters, and targeting of human rights defenders to suppress peaceful protests, the report notes. The findings of your report are alarming and are a challenge to us, to NGOs, to other governments, to the UN, to find ways to address these new lines of attack. I look forward to discussing the recommendations and your recommendations and how together we can rethink how society should function during and after the pandemic and try and persuade governments to become more just, and how to better show that active civil societies can help enable strong, healthy democracies in the region. Human rights defenders are at the center of these discussions. The Southeast Asia Collective can have a key leadership role in this process by continuing its documentation and advocacy and continuing to press for the rights of those defending rights. Thank you for having me, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Mary, for those thoughtful comments. May I request Dr. Deepak Thapa, Director of Social Science, Baha, to present the findings of the report, essentially the report in its capsule form, covering all the 7 different chapters, each dedicated to the 7 countries that we cover. Deepak, as I said, Director of Social Science Baha. Social Science Baha is among the founders of this South Asia Collective, and also leads production of our annual report. Deepak, you have the floor now. Thank you.
Thank you, Sujat. Thank you, Ms. Lawlor, for the setting the stage for the presentation of a report, which I hope I'll be able to do justice to, mainly because I've been asked to distill the contents of a rather weighty volume into a few slides. And with the help of my colleagues in other parts of South Asia, we've been able to do that. But you will have to read the report in order to get a sense of where we are. With this, let me share the screen. All right. This is always a challenge. Okay, I think I got it. This is the report. Those of you who were not who were impatient enough to go to the South Asia Collective website, as Sajad mentioned it, you'll have seen it. This is the cover. It consists of a number of sections, starting with the, excuse me, this is introduction. Just a minute. Which provides an overview of the status of civic space in South Asia. The time frame to be considered, and that was the brief given to all the countries, was after the current government came to power, which is different in different countries, but all more or less, apart from one specific exception in Bangladesh, all refer to the past 5 to 6 or 7 years. The individual chapters from 7 countries mentioned here. We also conducted an online survey on how civic space had been faring in the different countries with selected experts. This was not a random survey or anything. But due to lack of responses from many of the other countries, we were able to provide findings only from 4 countries. And apart from that, the report also contains a final section where there is an update on the state of minorities in the 7 countries in the year 2020. I'm going to present slides from the 7 countries. Some are longer, some are shorter, depending on the kind of findings we had. Each country working under constraints, and obviously the kind of information we were able to collect, especially given the pandemic, is also varied. So we start with Afghanistan, and we see here that after the National Unity Government came to power in 2014, the space that had opened up after the end of the Taliban regime gradually began to shrink. There have been attempts to restrict freedom of expression as well as assembly. The most insidious, obviously, is the various barriers that are put in place for NGOs to function. And the main difficulty for human rights defenders is the security threats that they have to function under, and the state of impunity enjoyed by those who are either issuing threats or acting on them. There is also the lack of any kind of laws that would protect human rights activists. And with the COVID-19 pandemic, the funding situation has been even worsened, mainly because of it was quite bad to begin with due to the various barriers put in place for civil society organizations to function. But after the pandemic started, it got even worse, and the government has not done anything to ameliorate the situation. In brief again, Bhutan, the state of civic space. This is among the first of the attempts made to understand the civic space in Bhutan, and that is what we tried to do. And it looked at the state of one religious minority group, the Christians. The finding is that legislation at the moment does not definitely say anything about creation of civic space or how the civic space can be preserved, nor does it say anything about religious minorities. But overall, civic space can be considered to be quite obstructed in Bhutan, and especially with the religious minority of Christians. They are forced to practice their religion more or less underground. They face various kinds of discrimination and are stigmatized for the faith that they follow. And of course, it does not help that they themselves are split because of their various sects that they're divided into. So the conclusion in the chapter was that the laws have to be amended to both to preserve the civic space, as well as to protect religious minorities. In the case of in Bangladesh, constitutional guarantees are there, recognizing equality for everyone, including the minorities. But then we see that they continue to face all kinds of atrocities. One of the key markers of the situation of minorities in Bangladesh is that the population of minorities has decreased over time. And then the rise of hate speech using social media has gone up. And Ahmadiyas, the sect of Ahmadiyas, continue to face harassment. Obviously, that's not only in Bangladesh, it's in other countries as well. And then Dalits, despite Bangladesh being a Muslim majority country, Dalits continue to face discrimination in Bangladesh. And the attempt to pass a law against discrimination has stalled for a number of years. There is also the issue of the indigenous peoples in the southeastern corner of Bangladesh. And the state has demonstrated its intolerance of any group working for indigenous people or with indigenous people, including resorting to disappearances of indigenous people's rights defenders. The sexual minorities are also in a similar situation. And of course, the Urdu-speaking population, also known as the Biharis, despite having finally gained the right to full citizenship, are quite wary of claiming those because of fear. The new laws that have been that have come into force all aimed at constricting civic space. India, of course, is the most complex of the countries to explain in a slide. But with the BJP having come to power in 2014, civil society has had difficulty functioning in all three areas. The key of civic space, expression, assembly, and association. One sees constrictions. To give some examples, these are the examples that have been provided here. Since 2014, 18 high-profile killings of journalists and activists. These are really high-profile that have received a lot of press. Journalists critical of government policies are targeted by the government under various laws, including, for instance, while covering violence against Dalit women, they've been charged with terrorism acts. News outlets that are critical of the government have been silenced through a number of ways. The raids is one, and the other is that has come out very strongly is the denial of government advertisements on which many of the media outlets rely. After the abrogation of Articles 370 and 35A in late 2019, there was a total, or near total, communication blackout of a kind not seen in the democratic world anywhere. The Indian print and broadcast media has been forced to toe the government line, and while doing so, are being increasingly used to take part in the expanding the scenario, the atmosphere of hate against Muslims and other minorities, or who, by the way, constitute 20% of the population in India. Freedom of assembly is also constricted. various laws that have been put in place by the government over the years are being increasingly used to target activists. Among them are the anti-terror laws and the old colonial era sedition acts. And of course, the famous Section 144, which is common to all the former British colonial countries in South Asia. Protesters have been dealt with force, and particularly after the Citizenship Amendment Act in 2019, which saw a lot of protests, and then following that, in earlier this year, has led to nearly 100 deaths. These are, of course, official. These are figures that have been counted of people who engaged in peaceful protests. In Kashmir, almost everyone was put under preventive detention after the abrogation of those two acts mentioned earlier. Freedom of association is becoming increasingly difficult, mainly because the NGO registrations, the government has used the stick of NGO registration to force civil society organizations to toe the line. The licenses are being suspended, and the renewal process has been made very difficult. And of course, one thing that is common to most of South Asia is the law against governing foreign currency regulations. It has, which was already restrictive, it has been made even stricter in the past few years. According to figures received from the government, 14,500 NGOs have been prohibited from getting foreign funds in the 5 years that the current government has been in power. The difficulty is more severe for grassroots organizations, but even organizations like Amnesty International have been targeted. And as we know, recently Amnesty has stopped its operations in India for the same reason. There are other ways in which human rights workers have been targeted by the state by the use of various arms of the state, including by the National Investigation Agency, raiding journalists and activists, an agency that was meant to investigate terror cases. So that's where we were with India. Nepal, existing laws on civil society organizations registration have always been cumbersome. All the new laws that have been proposed in the past few years have been even more restrictive, and especially, again, like in the other cases also, with regard to receipt of foreign funds. There has been an emphasis on service delivery instead of activism, and suspicion that, again, is common to almost all of South Asia, of faith-based Western NGOs, and the fear that all these NGOs are only interested in conversions. So to give a couple of examples, there was an attempt in 2019, and earlier attempt in 2018, to regulate the CSO sector, but this has not been successful, mainly because of strong opposition from both civil society and the donor community in Nepal. The latter is also very strong in Nepal because because Nepal has to rely so much on foreign funds. So donors are much more powerful than they are in other parts of South Asia. But then the governments have found another ways of getting around it, and they come up with various other policies which more or less have effect. Nepal, and just to give an example of how illiberal the Nepali government has become, they have even threatened to withhold pensions of civil servants if they were to criticize the government. That would incite any kind of social dissonance, which obviously is a very subjective issue that would be decided by the government. Nepal, since the current government came to power, Nepal has dropped 12 places in the Global Press Freedom Index as well. And a couple of years ago, we passed the criminal code, which could penalize journalists for publishing information that were considered confidential. Obviously, it's the government which is going to decide what is confidential or not. There have been other kinds of arrests that have been taking place in the name of various laws that have been put in place in the recent past. The pandemic has provided an opportunity for the government to be more suppressive, although it has also led to some kind of backlash. It has not been as bad as in the other countries. But then religious minorities, particularly Muslims, but also Christians, have been targeted, and the practices obstructed. The same kind of restrictions have not been placed on the two other traditional, two other faiths of Nepal, Hinduism and Buddhism. Pakistan, military regimes have been to blame for much of what ails the country, but the civilian governments also cannot escape blame for that. The politics of religion that started with the Second Amendment, declaring Ahmadiyya to be non-Muslims, followed by the blasphemy laws, which were ostensibly meant to protect all religions, but is used against religious minorities most of all. The Shia Hazara community had been facing the worst violence. So the National Commission for Human Rights of Pakistan, that's the statutory body, showed that 2,000 Hazaras have been killed in the previous 14 years, starting in 2018. Another fact-finding mission, this is an independent non-profit group, the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan, discovered that Christian students in Bhutan were under a lot of pressure from fellow students and teachers to disavow their own religion. And of course, another mission also found that there is a lot of forced conversions done of minorities, particularly Hindus, where people were being forced to convert prior to being married. Civil society, those of them who, and it's ironic that the same civil society who provide some kind of indication that Pakistan is still a liberal country, are being increasingly silenced. They're not speaking so much, mainly because of fear from both the government as well as fundamentalists. The military is in charge of many of the areas of governance, particularly when it comes to national security and foreign affairs. And as a result, civil society is monitored carefully, which includes making it difficult for civil society organizations to operate in the country, including through cumbersome processes such as registration difficulties, security clearance that is required, and for receiving foreign funding. Sri Lanka, there was a time between 2015 and 2019 when the Yapalanaya government, the good governance government, was in power. After the coming to power of this government, it was expected that civic space would open, but things soon went downhill after an initial promising beginning, particularly with the use of laws, which is the ICCPR Act of 2007. Sri Lanka does have such an act, which is meant to basically to provide protection on all the aspects mentioned in that convention. But it has been used to curb freedom of expression through selective use of the provisions of the Act. The Muslim community has been facing a lot of violence, and that has not been investigated. And of course, after the Easter Sunday attacks of 2019, the harassment of Muslims has only gone up, and that has now been extended to Muslim women as well because of the kind of The Tamil community continue to wait for a constitutional solution to the ethnic issue that has still not been resolved to everyone's satisfaction. There's a continuous movement of Sinhalese people into Tamil areas. As a result, there are more disputes over land. The demilitarization that was supposed to have happened after the end of the conflict in 2008 has still not taken place, and the land that had been occupied by the army has not been handed back. It was in this context that the Rajapaksa government, Gotabaya Rajapaksa's government, came to power in November 2019, and things have gone even further downhill after that. There is increasing use of self-censorship. There is no action against hate speech against all kinds of minorities, and surveillance of civil society organizations has gone up, and there is legislation that has been planned to further rein in civil society organizations. There is increasing militarization, with the Ministry of Defense playing a key role in various aspects of governance. The Tamil community's situation is getting somewhat even worrisome, with the increasing use of the Archaeological Act to declare certain land to be part of the government's land, and whereby depriving land that had been customarily used by Tamils. Muslims continue to face the same problem that they had in the earlier government also, but after the Easter Sunday attacks, the kind of harassment they faced has only gone up. The COVID-19 pandemic is problematic because the response is being led by the military. The Muslim community has been stigmatized, as in other countries, as carriers of COVID, and there has been no attempt by the state to counter that that kind of stigma that has been sent around. In fact, Muslims are being denied to bury their dead and are being forced to cremate the dead who died due to the COVID-19 virus. There have been attempts by the government also to restrict Tamil events, citing the risk of the pandemic. So that's where we are with Sri Lanka. We have also provided a list of recommendations that we think is common to all the governments, to all the countries in South Asia. So whereby, like for the national governments, we ask them to abide by the international commitments that they have made, which should have been gone without saying. A lot of contradictions within the national laws, which we've asked them to resolve. Again, civil society organizations need to be allowed to function freely. Many of the countries do not recognize minorities or grant them any kinds of rights in the constitution. We ask them to do that. And then to create a more safe environment for human rights defenders and civil society actors to function. And increasingly, the threats to minorities, both religious and otherwise, need to stop. And one of the ways to do that is to tackle those or take action against those responsible, so that the culture of impunity that seems to be the case in all the countries should end. And of course, like implement recommendations on the human rights defenders provided by the UN Special Rapporteur and other bodies should be taken seriously. And then the restrictions placed due to the pandemic be lifted as soon as possible. The international community should also ensure that the focus of attention on South Asia and the civil and political rights violations that are happening there should not end, and also encourage regional initiatives so that these common problems common to the region itself can be dealt with as a whole. Civil society groups in the countries themselves being asked to work together as a regional grouping so that the voice can be amplified against their own national governments, and to find ways in which they can work across the borders. These were the main recommendations that we had. And I think I've run out of time a long time ago, but I'd like to stop here and thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Deepak. We now have two distinguished discussants helping us look at the report, hopefully critically, and also helping to interpret the findings and some of the recommendations. May I first invite Ms. Deanne Uyangoda. Just to say, Deanne is an activist and human rights lawyer based in Colombo, Sri Lanka. She's currently the Asia Protection Coordinator for Frontline Defenders, which supports human rights defenders at risk. From 2010 to 2015, Deanne worked with the Law and Society Trust, Inform Human Rights Documentation Center, and a network of human rights defenders working on documentation of violations committed during and after, in the aftermath of the war in Sri Lanka, and support and protection for victims and their families. Since 2015, she has focused on litigation research, on advocacy on gender-based access to redress and protection, including but not limited to judicial interventions. Post-Easter Sunday attacks and the presidential elections in Sri Lanka, her work is refocused on combating criminalization, arbitrary detention, torture, and executive abuse of power and executive overreach. Thank you so much, Deanne. You have the floor now. Thank you.
Hi, Sajad. Thank you for the opportunity. And it's been great reading the report. And of course, the Sri Lanka chapter, and the India chapters that I'm more closely connected with. But I'm going to speak broadly on regional trends. And I think from what was shared so far, something that is clear is the pattern of who is most affected by the shrinking or the reduction of civic space, which is both the defenders, but also the communities they represent. And where the broad pattern that we can see from the work through 2020 is that those who are affected by shrinking space, or that term itself is very problematic, but really the attack on those advocating for rights. So I prefer to use the term those advocating for rights of those most affected, of people who are most affected by government policies and big business. Those that are caught, people who are caught at that intersection, whether they're Dalit, indigenous, language rights minorities, religious, ethnic, and it's also about resilience. And that's what COVID has brought out, that it is who is best placed to deal and survive with a pandemic and repressive governments that are using the pandemic to further limit your space for movement, to work and to organize and to live safely and with dignity. And there are some of us who may come out of this much better than others, and that is due to the intersection of where we are located, and also our resilience based on where we're located, and recognizing that human rights defenders who do not come from those spaces are really struggling to survive vis-a-vis repressive governments and the pressures brought on by the pandemic. We have seen this in India, we've seen it in Sri Lanka, we've seen it in Nepal. In Nepal in particular, we've talked to Madhesi defenders, Madhes Tarai human rights defenders. I don't know whether any of them are part of this call, but who have seen who have historically seen a very difficult time in terms of impunity for past crimes and accountability for ongoing violations. In Nepal, in governments like Nepal, which have more democratic credentials, we're seeing houses being demolished of indigenous people violating court orders because they can, with bulldozers that do not bear number plates. This is the reports we're getting from defenders. This is the reports and the information we're getting. And it is because they can, because oppressors across the region seem to have a limited vulnerability, not just to the pandemic, but also to the state response to pandemic. And this is what we're talking about in the context of shrinking civic space. It is not an even playing field. It is a very uneven space that we're working in. And if you are Dalit, a woman, or someone identifying, a person identifying as a woman, LGBT, indigenous, poor, economically poor, do not have access to capital in terms of city, you are far more vulnerable. And I think this is something that is critical in our understanding of how we as a collective respond to the space that we deal with. And also looking at laws and regulations that are raised across the board, across regions. We see laws that are meant to protect, like in Sri Lanka, like the ICCPR Act, that are used, actually cherry-picked and used against defenders. We see the use of anti-terror laws on human rights activist defenders. And India has been a good example of this. In Pakistan, we have seen the Official Secrets Act used against Idris Khatak, who was a defender abducted in 2019, November. We only knew about his whereabouts in mid-2020, and now he is still incommunicado, and we still treat him as someone who is being held incommunicado because we don't know where he is being held, and the Official Secrets Act is being used against him. I think a lot has been said about the FCRA in India and other legislation that may impact on the work of defenders, but also on the dignity with which we associate and the dignity with which we work. This matters a lot to those who are working at the margins and those who are really relying on the finances and the resources that come from the larger organizations that can then transfer funds, which is, as said in this report, then effectively blocked by the new amendments to the FCRA in 2020. Broadly speaking, just to also touch on the ongoing struggles raised by COVID-19, which I've also touched on, which is that increasingly for defenders, there's no option to leave your home, your district, your location, and certainly your country. In the region we live in, visas are not so easy to come by. And it's about in-country protection. And how do we think through how defenders can balance the advocacy they want to do, engaging with the state or allies within the state, and then also keeping themselves and their families safe. And this is a very gender neutral approach. It doesn't really apply in the same way to women or those who identify as women. Men deal with the threats, I suspect, very differently. And the threats that women face because of their gender and how they identify, the space they take up, the public space they take up, the impact on their families is very different. So, and when we talk about risk and threat, it's also very gendered. You shouldn't have to come to someone with killing, torture, abduction, arbitrary detention to get the attention of national law, international institutions. So broadly, I think it's about how we understand advocacy in this country, in this region. It's about how we understand resilience and how we appreciate those most at risk. And when we do country profiles, just putting human beings at the forefront of that and recognizing that there is a deep state in each country, which is a confluence of nationalist rhetoric, right-wing nationalist rhetoric, which feeds on religious and ethnic fervor, but then also is about big corporate interests. And the business and human rights angle, which is now becoming more prominent internationally, is something local defenders have always known. And in terms of way forward, I will end with that. I think there's a lot to learn from how resilience and coping and surviving has been built, and dignity has been built in movements across our region. And really learning from that, listening to that, and then using international mechanisms strategically, recognizing when it is a time to document and then it is a time to advocate safely. And just really listening to what people on the ground are saying. So reports like this that I'm very, very happy to be part, like to come in on, are very important at placing on record the kind of difficulties that we faced in the region through 2020. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Deanne. Very helpful summary of the situation on the ground, but also pathways to future action. Our next expert in the panel is Poonam Joshi. Poonam is the director of the Funders Initiative for Civil Society, a London-based donor network established to enable philanthropy to respond strategically to the phenomenon of closing civic space. In the past, Poonam has led funders initiatives at Sigrid Rousing Trust and Fund for Global Human Rights, among others, to create enabling environment for civil society, including in response to the Arab Spring. Poonam started her career as a legal aid lawyer, specializing in criminal defense and family law. She subsequently worked for several years as head of Amnesty's UK Women's Rights Program. She's a trustee of Southall Black Sisters and Lawyers for Justice in Libya, among others. Poonam, please.
Thank you very much, Sajad, and thank you for the invitation to speak today and the opportunity to read this excellent report. I have been part of a community of funders looking at the issue of civic space. Sorry, my video wasn't on. I've been part of a community of funders looking at the issue of closing civic space for around the last 6 or 7 years. And I think, as is always the way with the attention both of civil society and philanthropic foundations, we tend to gravitate to particular contexts that seem very emblematic of a trend. So there's been a lot of attention on India in recent years and of places like Brazil, Russia. But I think when reading this report, what struck me was the absence of a focus in that broader discourse around civic space on what's happening across South Asia. And so many of the insights and the trends captured in the report will be important in feeding that global understanding of these trends. And I want to primarily share 2 reflections. I'm going to be focusing on drivers in particular. So I wanted to share reflection on how the role of politics of security and the politics of religion has been covered in this report, and how that could be linked to global trends. And then a very brief reflection at the end around economic interest as a driver that Deanne has just highlighted as well. So my main focus is really around the politics of security. And I think one of the things that the report covers very well is how security laws, discourse and tools have been over-applied and abused to target minorities and their advocates. And of course that the over-application is rooted in national histories and regional geopolitics, but there's a bigger picture where the same governments who have been viewed probably by civil society as advancing domestic agendas are actually part of a much larger project around counterterrorism and security, which not only has given them cover to abuse the politics of security for civic repression, but is actually equipping them with powers, tools, financing to consolidate that power. And so the case that I would make to those on the call today is a call to build on mapping and documentation in the report and striving to better understand how this global architecture interacts with the national security architecture and discourse, and whether that offers routes for countering this. So a great deal of the restrictions documented in the report emanate from the politics of security: preemptive arrest, detentions, criminalization of protest, censorship of media in the name of security, restrictions on information, messaging apps, internet shutdowns, content takedown, surveillance and smear attacks are rooted, as I said, in the local politics of security, but also the global. And that global context starts with 9/11 and the UN Security Council in US pushing a proliferation of laws globally in the name of the war on terror. And what you see with that global campaign is a massive expansion of security architecture and norms globally, not just at the international level, but also at the national, and a linking of those national security actors, police, military, intelligence, with each other, with across regions and across borders transnationally. And at the heart of the logic of that sort of pulsing security ecosystem that's developed over the last 2 decades are 2 factors that really lend these security frameworks to abuse. So there's a focus on, an increasing focus on preemptive security, the desire to neutralize threats before they materialize. And that was noted in a number of the chapters where increasingly governments are bypassing the need for due process and evidence and can now arrest and criminalize people on the basis of speculation about what their intentions are. But there's also been at the heart of this security project a failure of the UN to set definitions around terrorism and extremism. So it's left to every government to decide how to interpret those terms. And when that takes place in a context where you also have an overall erosion over the last couple of decades in the checks and balances offered by parliaments and the courts, you have a situation where governments are able to use broadly worded security laws to target anyone deemed to be a threat. And we've seen this in the wording and the application of many of the laws highlighted in this report. But another dimension which is covered in the report, but not in terms of the origins of where it comes from. So a common pattern across almost all the countries was this restrictions on foreign funding and administrative harassment. And some of that is, of course, based in national agendas in terms of controlling dissent, controlling minorities, but it's also rooted in that global counterterrorism security frameworks. So there is a particular set of global norms around stopping terrorist funding cross borders. And what we've seen over recent years is a significant correlation when governments are required to comply with that norm and a tightening up of foreign funding restrictions country by country. That's been well documented in relation to India and the tightening up of the FCRA in 2010. It would be interesting to see how much that is a pattern across the region. Hand in hand with these security frameworks, governments are also getting access to new technologies, and that preemptive security agenda has driven the evolution of tech that enables states to engage in digital repression, surveillance, blanket internet shutdowns, as we've seen in India, Kashmir, development of facial recognition technologies and surveillance. And you know, who's behind the production of those technologies? In terms of states, most notably China, Israel, Russia have spent years perfecting the use of these tools on their own religious minorities and opponents, and are now exporting tech and know-how, but there's also companies behind this. So the context that I know best is in terms of India and Israel, but it would be very interesting to document those relationships between governments in South Asia and externally in where they're getting their technologies and know-how. And then finally, those laws and tools aren't sufficient in themselves to give governments legitimacy to use and abuse them. So they're relying on the politics of fear to smear minorities and critics, activists, journalists, academics, students as threats to security. And that enables them to simultaneously advance their majoritarian agendas, but also expand powers which can be used for control and management, not just of minorities, not just of opponents, but more broadly. So what you see in that confluence of the national and the international is the creation of a massively conducive environment, simultaneously for the abuse of civic freedoms, but also minorities, and a situation in which governments in South Asia can rely on the fact that governments around the world are abusing security frameworks norms in similar ways, so aren't going to condemn them or hold them to account. And we see this not only in governments with autocratic, authoritarian leanings, Turkey, Egypt, Pakistan, Hong Kong, Philippines, but also in democracies, and so most recently in the US and in France. In terms of what this means in the scale of restrictions you're seeing, the UN Special Rapporteur on Counterterrorism and Human Rights has described this use of security laws and frameworks as the mothership of closing civic space. And in 2018, Mary, you'll be very familiar with this, there was analysis done of data gathered by the UN Special Rapporteur over a 13-year period. And frontline defenders found that 58% of the cases they were dealing with and 66% of the cases the Special Rapporteur had received concerned the abuse of counterterrorism laws to criminalize human rights defenders and environmental defenders. So what you're seeing, I think, as the Special Rapporteur has described, is not an inadvertent impact of security laws leading to civic repression. This is hardwired into the system. These are what these laws are being used for. Then just briefly, just touching on 2 points. So the politics of religion, which was once again covered comprehensively in the report, is certainly mirrored in a global trend where we're seeing religious conservatives and fundamentalists from every religion seeking to dismantle constitutional and legal protections for minorities and women in particular, but also, and I think this was covered very well in particular country case studies, engaging in sustained campaigns to shift cultural norms through securing cultural hegemony, through capture, collusion, or the apathy of media so they can disseminate their narratives around hate and create polarization, but also in attacks on sites of independent and critical thought, on schools, universities, academic. We saw that covered in a number of the case studies. We're seeing this done globally. So for example, we're seeing the US evangelical Christian right behind the financing of anti-gender campaigns that mirror sort of very similar patterns in Latin America, Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, but also in contexts like Turkey, Brazil, Poland, Hungary. And all of those regions, activists are strategizing, they're seeking to learn cross-border. The nativist right and the religious right are very good at learning from each other. And I would suggest that we need to be able to do the same across South Asia, but with other regions. Very finally and briefly, the omission in terms of drivers, though Deanne covered it, is the role of corporate interests in driving closing civic space of minorities and civic space more broadly. It's covered in the India case study where it's been documented very well in recent years. But I was kind of curious about its omission in, for example, contexts like Pakistan and Balochistan. Any countries who are resource rich, where minorities are viewed as a threat or a barrier to economic development. I think we need to be looking at who's benefiting when space is closed down for these communities. And what that also does is, in terms of both raising a question, also offers a potential entry point for targeting actors involved other than governments. So for example, investors, international financial institutions, companies themselves. So I'm going to conclude on that point, but I think in making the link between the national and global, I think particularly all of these three trends, particularly the politics of security and religion, feel incredibly entrenched and very difficult to counter. I think as soon as you start seeing them as part of a global set of trends, but also project, what that does is open up avenues for influencing, advocacy, targeting other actors for example, within the global security architecture, within the global economy. And that gives a sort of an additional range of tools to minorities and the advocates in South Asia that they might not be aware of at the moment. But I'm going to conclude there and really look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Poonam. So much food for thought. It's a shame that we planned this whole thing just for an hour, because this is all very rich material for some deeper discussion. But we'll hopefully organize something again soon where we can give these the space that they deserve. May I now? Well, actually, we have already run over time, so I think we'll need to see how we can do the Q&A, the sort of the interactive session in less than the 30 minutes that we had budgeted. Don't want all of you to be kept waiting. So maybe what we now do is request the country authors. Initially, we planned for about 4 to 5 minutes each, but now I think we'll have to cut it down to about 2 to 3 minutes of your responses to specific questions that have already been raised. I see lots of comments mostly, but also some questions in chat box. So maybe we can respond to them, to any direct questions, also comments. But also have anything else to say, especially on how your current, your country findings, in a sense, relate to regional trends and dynamics. So with that, let me begin by calling upon Hussain Anosh. Anosh is the Executive Director at Civil Society and Human Rights Network, the premier Afghan human rights group. And I see, Anosh, that there was one direct question on Afghanistan about the coverage of attacks against Sikhs earlier this year, not getting the coverage that it deserved, etc. But if you want to respond to that, but also on the wider question. Thank you, Anosh.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Sajjad. Thank you for the distinguished guests that they were talking about our report. And thank you from the participants. Yes, there were 2 questions on Afghanistan. One was that of the coverage of the report on attacks of the Hindu Sikhs and also Shia Hazara minorities, that the issues were covered in our bulletins. Please check the South Asia Collective website. So there you will find that we have covered these issues there in our bulletins. As the topic of the report was about shrinking civic spaces, so we have not covered the actual attacks, and it was also about the civic spaces as well. So, and then the next discussion was on the NGO laws that's under negotiation of the government, that they want to change a lot this law, and Mr. Ahmadi mentioned this. We have elaborated this in the report. Please click on the link, so you will find the detailed information on the link. And then thank you. I would like to thank MRG and South Asia Collective for this initiative that really have helped the CSOs around the South Asia to work together and to share the common challenges that face the whole region. So that's it from my side. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anosh. Next on the list is Bangladesh, and may I request Dr. S.M. Masoom Billah, the lead author of the Bangladesh chapter of the report. Masoom is Associate Professor of Law at Jagannath University. and he wrote the chapter on behalf of Nagarik Udyog, Dhaka-based community empowerment group that works with a range of Bangladesh's religious, linguistic, and caste minorities. Masoom, I don't see any direct questions questions on Bangladesh, but if you have thoughts to share. Also on that, I think a general question about particular government structures, ministries, etc., or commissions related to minorities, if you had anything to say on that.
Thank you, Sajjad. Thank you so much. Am I audible? Yeah, but yes, I'm trying to start my video. Yeah, I think you can see me now. Thank you, Sajjad, for giving me the floor. I extend my heartiest congratulations to MRG and SAC for this occasion. I have also learned from the discussions and the key note presenter, Ms. Mary Lawlor. Yes, there was one, I think it was not specific about Bangladesh, but on wanted to know about how and which authority controls and look over the affairs of NGO is the NGO Affairs Bureau under the Prime Minister's office. They oversee the NGO affairs and CSO matters, also in some cases the Ministry of Social Welfare Affairs. You see, I'm a law teacher. I was involved in authoring the Bangladesh chapter with Nagarik Udyog. I extend my thanks to Manjurul Islam, Policy Advocacy Coordinator and Executive Director of Nagarik Udyog, Mr. Zakir Hussain, for helping me all out. You see, in pandemic situation, it was a very challenge to collect data, but as we have mentioned that we have talked to our stakeholders and some experts in making the preparation, in preparing the report, also consulted the primary and secondary data. The main purpose of our chapter was to relate the shrinking civic space with the minority rights. We have covered more or less 6 communities, like the Dalit communities in Bangladesh, the Urdu-speaking communities in Bangladesh, the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, the Ahmadiyya Muslim sects, and also indigenous community and LGBT communities in Bangladesh. You see, after 2014, we see a trend in Bangladesh. I'm not sure whether it is related to the form of the government, but it is about the law making process itself. When the election process has not been accepted warmly with from all the quarters, I think that has a toll in the lawmaking process, which ultimately comes up with a law that has a huge toll on the right to speech and freedom of expression. Most notably, the 2018 Digital Security Act has been criticized in Bangladeshi by this Bangladeshi civil societies and right activists, and the space for the human rights defenders and the minority defenders has been very constrained. With those challenges, we have also other challenges as well. But if you have any particular specific questions regarding our chapter, we'll be happy to respond. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Masoom. We next have Nepal, and we have Dr. Jeevan Bania, who's Assistant Director at Social Science Baha in Kathmandu, and the lead author of the Nepal chapter. Jeevan, if you'd like to engage with a couple of questions I see on Nepal, but also more broadly. And just before Jeevan speaks, request everyone to please use the chat box, post your questions there for some of the countries that we'll be covering soon. Thank you. Jeevan, please.
Thank you, Sajjad. Thank you, everyone participating in today's event. Actually, I have already replied most of the questions in the chat box itself, so I think I don't want to take a long time. But just to clarify that, Deepak did not have enough time to go into the detail about what each of the content chapter constitutes. But just to clarify a couple of issues about whether the chapter discusses about atrocities and human rights violations against minorities, including Dalits. Basically, we focus on how legal regimes and policy provisions, particularly after 2015, have restricted or constricted the spaces and opportunities for these minority groups in order to advocate for their rights or even to operate or functions. So we've included those things. Unfortunately, we did not carry out the primary research. It was basically based on the test review and analysis. So whenever there are references to these events and there is kind of harassment against minorities, including Dalits, we've covered them. But basically, our focus in the chapter has been how the environment for these groups have been closing or opening up historically, let's say. But we focus on that aspect, and we try to analyze various laws and policies in regards to that. Given that the focus was on whether and how these civic spaces have been closing or opening up for these groups has been the theme of this year. We could not basically focus on particular groups here, so we have been quite broad in that sense. In regards to the questions about the regulating body, it's basically the Social Welfare Council that has been the primary regulating body for activities and activities of NGOs and civil society organizations here in Nepal. But off and on, you can also see that Ministry of Home or Office of the Prime Minister itself has also been interested to govern or control the activities of various actors in the civil sphere. I will stop here. I have replied, I think, most of the questions in the chat box itself. If you have more questions, then we'd love to respond to them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeevan. And just to add to what Jeevan said, and also a point that I think Anush made earlier on about perhaps if readers have noticed less of a sort of description of focus on, say, atrocities or the coverage of the range of atrocities, primarily because in the way we structure these reports, every year we choose a thematic focus. This year the theme was narrowing of civic space, etc. So you'll find a lot of the discussions, the documentation around that. But what we also do is, if you notice, a chapter right at the end, which is more like an update of the situation of minorities, where you'll find much of this, sort of a cataloging of targeting any new laws unrelated to civic space and that sort of targeting, but anything related to minorities. So it's essentially a catalog of developments over the past 1 year. That's where you'll find most of the documentation on violence, on specific discrimination, etc. But the main body sort of engages more with the thematic focus of the year. Right. So let's carry on. The next, may I now request Elaine Alam, author of the Pakistan chapter, to please respond, engage with some of the comments, questions, etc. Elaine is a founding member and Secretary General of Formation Awareness and Community Empowerment Society, FACES, which is based in Lahore. Elaine, please.
Thank you. Good morning from my side, and congratulations to MRG and the South Asia Collective. This is a milestone that we achieve, and there's so much that goes into it. So it's a pleasure to speak about this. And of course, it's such a pleasure to have Ms. Lawlor here. And Poonam, thank you for the very insightful comments earlier. And I'll just try make an effort to respond to that as well. Something that, because a lot was covered, of course, and there are a few similarities in the region. What I'd like to point out is actually, it comes as no surprise. The regimes in Pakistan come as no surprise to anyone. It's something that's been very historic, and the rise of the fundamentalism, institutionalized and systematic fundamentalist thought came with the Ziaul Haq regime, so that comes as no surprise. And then following that, there have been these dictatorial, institutionalized systems of controlling power, and also subjugating religious minorities in particular. What was important also for me when we were writing this report was to look at the reasons of why so many new phenomena of restricting civic space are coming around, the reasons behind it, and what is new that is happening around this subject, and why is this taking place, and also what are the consequences and the reasons for this. Some of the new phenomena that came into that have come forward are, of course, if you look at the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, the way that movement is being restricted in the northern part of Pakistan, because of a group of passionate young people, and also sitting parliamentarians, which is very interesting that they are sitting parliamentarians in the national government, whose voices are being restricted, and they are not being allowed to also visit certain parts of the country. That is one new phenomenon that has come to the surface. It is gaining a lot of traction, and it is a big factor of restricting civic space. The other thing, of course, is the increasing restrictions on civil society and intellectual thought, which includes journalists, academics. I won't go into the deep details because we've covered a lot of that in the report, and I'd be happy to take questions even after we finish this session. So journalists, academics, this is new. Also something that that is being when openly discussed on national television with the Prime Minister and with other important government subjects. This is being there is no particular response that comes from the government or even from the Prime Minister when questioned about these issues. So also the restricting laws on NGOs, on civil society, on journalists and academia, which is also laws on detention that have been revised. Digital security, someone mentioned that earlier, and that is also something of increasing concern that civil society organizations are looking into and trying to sort of decipher, because the law is it has loopholes, the law is so complicated, and there are organizations in Pakistan that are now trying to decipher what that law actually talks about and what you can do and what you cannot do on a digital space. So that's something also that we are looking at. And of course, then coming to religious minorities, which is also our cross-cutting focus of our report every year, looking at the increasing translation from the blasphemy laws to forced conversions. And then you begin to think it's not just the laws that are problematic, but it's also the mindset, socio-cultural norms, and this restriction on the part of the government, which really has to be countered in a collective manner. So that was that, and I'd like to just address what Poonam brought up about Balochistan and Pakistan, and also there's a question from one of my known colleagues, in fact, in Pakistan, Mr. Iqbal Hyderabad. And both of these, I would like to address this with saying that this is, if we look at, these are all political economy factors. If we look at why certain groups in Pakistan why certain religious minority groups do not face the same inequalities, and also who benefits in Balochistan and Pakistan from these it's a larger political economy question. And it is, if we look, of course, the Sikhs are bringing in a lot of the revenue in Pakistan. So that is one, like Mr. Iqbal Haider Butt mentioned just now. So I don't think I have enough time to go into the greater details, but I would just like to leave you with this, that it is a political economy question. Even in Balochistan, the way the issues are being handled, this is largely got to do with the political economy of Balochistan. Historically, we know who has been benefiting from this. It's the military outfits. It's, if we look at the CPEC interest, it's between this tussle between the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor with the civil government and the military government, and largely the Baloch people are being ignored. And of course, then when we look at, apart from just the Baloch people, the minorities within Balochistan are even further disadvantaged, and their voices mainly do not count in this whole process. So I think I've gone overboard with time, and I'd be happy to respond even later. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Aline. Thank you. We have Sakuntala Kadir Gamar, Executive Director of Law and Society Trust, again, another one of the founding members of the South Asia Collective, who, along with Ambika Satkunanathan, former Commissioner of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka, authored the Sri Lanka chapter. Sakuntala, please. Sakuntala, hello, yes.
Sorry, am I unmuted now? Hello, I've lost the video. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yes, we can hear you, Sakuntala.
I'm sorry, the video seems to have disappeared, but I just wanted to clarify that the author of the Sri Lanka chapter was entirely Ambika Satkunanathan. I was the coordinator of the chapter, so credit goes to her. And I would actually like her to make some comments on the chapter as well as the context. And if there are gaps to fill, I would do that. So Ambika, over to you. Ambika?
Thank you, Saku. And yes, can you hear me? Yeah, I'm unmuted now. Yes, thank you, Saku, and thank you, Sajad, and for everyone for the excellent presentations. I think for me, when I see the patterns regionally, I think where we should be functioning as early warning systems to each other. Because I remember a few years ago, before Narendra Modi came into power, or after he did, and we could see what was happening, we warned our Indian friends, and we said, well, to us, it is like deja vu. So I think we can function as early warning systems to each other because we see these patterns being repeated in the region. I think in Sri Lanka, what we're seeing now is that the law is being used as a tool. So instead of, enforce disappearances or using white vans, what we have is that legal means are being used, and in particular also targeting finances of civil society organizations. The other key issue, which I think also has regional as well as global resonance, is also increased militarization, and particularly militarization of policing, which we are seeing all over the world. It's not particular to us. And I think an important point that Deanne alluded to and also Poonam raised was the corporates, the role of the corporates, because in places like India, Sri Lanka, and I think even in the US, for instance, we see media houses, large media houses, facilitating hate speech, spreading hate speech, and also supporting authoritarian regimes. And they might even influence elections. And in this, what we see also is another angle, particularly I think in our region, where you see external regional investments. So you can see China coming in, and then also who ties up with them. It's the corporates who might be having the links to the state. So there is kind of this unholy relationship going on. So those are just the main kind of common patterns and trends that I would like to flag. And once again, I mean, to thank you for asking me to be part of this, and congratulations on the publication of the report. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We have run significantly over time. Mary has had to leave us. Sadly, she had another engagement. I'm so glad that Poonam and Deanne are still here. I know, Poonam, you have an emergency at home. So if you can give us another couple of minutes, I wanted to quickly move on to conclusion. There was something I wanted to mention about India, but let me just mention, just responding to that question about structures, ministries, etc. Very quickly before coming to you, Poonam and Deanne. So yeah, in India we have the Minorities Ministry, the Central Minorities Ministry. Several states have state minority ministries. We also have the National Commission for Minorities, which is an autonomous body, or intended to be an autonomous body, the central level as well as in various states. And then you have other entities such as the National Human Rights Commission, etc., etc. I mean, yeah. So there's a large network of these structures, executive, independent, etc., meant to safeguard and protect minority rights. But India is a great example at the same time of how you can put in place systems and structures and yet not have systems that have that actually deliver. So yeah, in formulaic terms, it's all there. But when it comes to the National Human Rights Commission, for instance, the National Commission of Minorities, actually acting as institutions of redress for minority targeting, discrimination, they're just not present. They just don't respond. So just that very quick response, and we see this happening particularly over the last few years. So increasingly being hollowed out, although they've not been dismantled completely, as if in terms of not being abolished. Well, with that, I think, and I am afraid we will have to try to come to a conclusion. So may I please request Poonam first, and then Deanne for your concluding remarks, a couple of minutes, please. Thank you.
Sajid, thank you very much. I'll just keep this very brief. I mean, I think the report is a really important contribution to global understanding around the patterns of closing civic space. And I think in one of the reports, it could have been on Pakistan or Bangladesh, that the writer noted that the treatment of minorities is an indicator of the broader health of democracy and civic space. So I think one of my concluding thoughts is what more could be done to build alliances with civil society more broadly in defense of democracy. And I think in my reflections on those drivers, what more can be done to better understand that confluence of national and global drivers, and to, yes, engage in solidarity, but move beyond that to engage in shared strategizing with movements, both those led by religious or racial minorities, but also broader civic movements who are facing the same trends and are often being targeted. I think the point Elaine just made around who benefits from closing civic space, a number of those actors are global, are transnational in nature. And what more can we do together to hold some of those actors to account, and in that process shed light on what's happening within South Asia, so attention isn't just focused on India, which is often in the limelight, sadly, in terms of closing civic space issues, but the region as a whole. But I think what the report also does, and the commonality of those trends, is also gives impetus for the kind of work the collective has been doing, which is transcending that nationalist, nativist, siloed rhetoric, and seeing are there ways that those involved in this initiative can develop shared strategies in precisely the way that their governments are. Just a sort of final point, in the security architecture context, it's very interesting how even long-standing historical rivals can come together around shared objectives. And there's a body called the Shanghai Cooperation Council, where India, Pakistan, and China come together, because what transcends their kind of rivalries is their desire to consolidate power and control their citizens. And I'm not saying that we learn from their tactics, but there's something there to be learned, that even if those great rivals can come together to close civic space collectively, I think we could do a much better job of coming together to share our shared space across South Asia.
Thank you so much, Poonam. Thank you. Deanne, please.
Hi, so I'm just going to jump right in from where Poonam left off, and borrowing from what Ambika said also earlier. Early warning signs. We never thought, for instance, that India would be in this space. We always thought that our national institutions were stronger than that we were not like everyone else. Somehow, that many of us just believe that this could withstand. And the second term has taught us that it cannot. And as much as we don't want things to be India-led, we also need to recognize that there are warning signs of what Sri Lanka went through, that we're watching in India, and then the Pakistan rhetoric inside and outside, which is not entirely consistent, not at all, in fact. In Nepal and Afghanistan, in Maldives, where there is very little space for very, very limited space to function as women, as LGBTIQ, I would say none to non-existent. So just picking up on broader South Asia strategies where the patterns seem obvious, and when you look at the kind of surveillance and the restrictions and regulations, it's very clear, as Poonam said, that they're talking to each other, but we are perhaps not talking enough. So how do we build those strategies outside of our silos, like Poonam said, in terms of building those conversations? And then also, how do we go back to the communities that are most affected and making sure that our work is grounded? And for me personally, that is something I learned only in India, in the way that you can function without computers, without anything, without that ground-based work that you do with communities on the ground and work. And I know there are defenders doing that across the region, in Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Maldives, Nepal, Afghanistan. So picking up on that from both silos and linking people who are not necessarily seen as being including within the mainstream human rights movement. And that's the kind of fracture that these governments are very good at picking up on, because they know we're not really one homogeneous entity, are we? So not just, and we can connect perhaps across class and across certain civil society frameworks, but we don't always represent everyone. So how do we make sure that we build a broader consciousness to counter this kind of awful reprisals and backlash and regulations that we're seeing that actually have a dangerous impact on individual people's lives, not just internationally, but also locally? And how do we build that? That's really a challenge that many of us are grappling with. And I think sometimes these reports are very useful just as a gathering point to start conversations off, and then to build the work that many amazing people are doing in each of these countries. So yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all those encouraging and hopeful suggestions. I just wanted to pick up very quickly before concluding the point about Maldives, and I think there was a question as well from one of the participants, why not include Maldives? Maldives we tried initially in the beginning when we were trying to put together the sort of the platform. Reached out through friends in Colombo, but there wasn't much of a headway there, primarily because of the reasons you mentioned, Deanne, here. Just the absence of, complete absence of civic space, perhaps, in Maldives. But yes, I think we should try again. And the other country that we wanted to include within the South Asia Collective initial rounds of discussions and scoping was Myanmar, Burma, although not strictly within what is understood as South Asia, but with loads and loads of historical, but also present day sort of interactions and overlaps. But definitely Maldives is something we should and we will continue to explore, try to get a partner there who we can include within the group. So with that, friends, we come to the end of this webinar, releasing the South Asia State of Minorities Report 2020, Minorities and Shrinking Space. Let me take this opportunity on behalf of the South Asia Collective to thank all of you for making time to be with us and for your comments and insights. And we are so grateful, especially to our distinguished panel, Mary Lawlor, Deanne, Uyangoda, and Poonam Joshi for their time and guidance. Before I close, a couple of announcements. The report is now available on our website, of course, to download freely. Please do send in your comments and suggestions. There's a little email address on our website, sac@theSouthAsiaCollective.org. It'll be great to have your comments, suggestions on the report, but also on the bulletin, etc. That we produce. The program for country level launches, this was a global in a sense, but for country launches, the report will be available on our website soon, and I request all of you in your respective countries to participate in those when they're held, because there will be an opportunity there for more in-depth country level discussions. Please also sign up for our quarterly bulletins, which are produced every 3 months, documenting and tracking matters of concern to South Asian minorities. The next one is due in February 2021. You can find previous editions of the bulletin on our website. And finally, the theme for our next report, 2021, is hate speech and minorities. A theme we found with much relevance to the region. So look forward to engaging with all of you, both in the production of the report as well as in its release towards the end of 2021. With that, let me say a big thank you to all of you who attended for being with us. To all South Asia Collective members, all the national leads and their teams, and to Minority Rights Group International, who have been fellow travelers in this journey, actually since the birth of the idea of South Asian Collective, a South Asian Forum for and on human rights, on minority rights, way back in 2015. Thank you very much, and thank you so much, Joshua, for also making time to be with us today. And finally to Ifra, Nina, Abhimanyu, Ritika, Normana, Mona Lisa, and others for setting up this call today. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.